Welcome to the Inspiring Leadership Podcast, where we seek to elevate your leadership and transform your workplace. My name is Dominic Seow. I'm delighted to be the host of this show. With my team at eqstrategist, we seek to bring you a dose of healthy inspiration and practical insights into how to enhance team performance, cultivate resilience, foster collaboration, and shape culture. Many leaders have experienced this moment. You present an idea that is logical, well thought through, and yet it gets rejected. Not because it's wrong, but because somehow it just doesn't land. So what's really going on in those moments? In today's episode, we explore a powerful and often overlooked lens: the psychology behind how people make decisions and what it takes to influence without authority. At eqstrategist, much of our work involves supporting technical professionals, brilliant experts, to make the transition from being valued for what they know to being trusted for how they influence and lead. And that's why I'm particularly excited about today's conversation. I'm joined by Claire Wang, who has spent over 2 decades working across banking, insurance, telecoms, and technology across Asia, Oceania, and Europe, helping organizations make smarter, more profitable decisions through pricing. But what's most fascinating is that much of her work involved influencing multi-million-dollar decisions without formal authority, persuading executives, aligning teams, and driving change by earning trust rather than relying on title. Today, she helps professionals do exactly that, to communicate ideas so clearly and credibly that others want to act on them. In this conversation, we explore how leaders can apply these insights to get buy-in, reduce resistance, and ultimately make yes the natural outcome. Claire, welcome to Inspiring Leadership.
Thank you, Dorm. Thank you for the invitation. Super excited to be here to share with your audience, the secret behind pricing and how we can use the pricing principle to improve our influence skills.
Absolutely brilliant. Claire, you've built your career in pricing strategy. What first drew you to understanding how people perceive value and make decisions?
Okay. So I guess maybe it's worthwhile to explain to, the audience, like, what is it? What is pricing? Because naturally, when you say the word pricing, what comes to people's mind is someone putting a price tag on a product, right? But in fact, in pricing, a big part of what we do is trying to understand what is it that our customers see good about our product. So in a way, how can we describe the benefits to customers so effectively that they will see, it's worth their penny. So the idea behind that is understand this like customer value, customer psychology, and then this rigorous process leads to, okay, what sort of like price makes sense for these people to buy. But another thing that people don't see, which is really behind the closed door, is before we can set a price for our end customers, we have to first convince our executives, our stakeholders, that this is the right price to set. So as you can imagine, like the first sale is actually not to the end customers. Our first customers is actually our internal colleagues. People, normally this kind of decision gets done in a pricing committee. So we have to convince the head of several different departments. And pricing normally kind of like sits in between. It's like a bridge trying to link all these different departments. What that means is that at any point in time, we don't really have direct control or direct power of each of those departments, but we rely a lot on their execution to make this idea happen. And that's when I first realized, actually, you know what, like pricing job is actually not just about doing the calculation. It's actually really mastering the skill of influence, because that is part of the job.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful insight. So, what I'm hearing you say is pricing is part of a job very often of a financial analyst. And yet, unless you price it in a way that resonates with an audience, they can see the benefit, right? They are unlikely to proceed with the decision. Tell me, I know that our audience is already seeing an incredibly articulate speaker and influencer. We'd love to learn a little bit more about your background. I understand that you have a technical background. Tell us a little bit about your backstory, Claire. I know that we're chipping in. I'm here in Sydney. You're in Paris. But, tell us a little bit about the human being behind the mic today, Claire.
Sure. Okay. My background has been very technical, which is why, this whole influence journey, I've kind of sort of like learned it the hard way. So I started my career firstly as a medical scientist in epidemiology. So I was actually doing research in a medical laboratory. And in my last year, so you would know this dorm in Australia, you do an honors year and then you decide, should I do a PhD or should I do something else? And it was during my honors year, I got to learn this new discipline. Well, not new, but I didn't know that at that time in actuarial. And my best friend was doing actuarial. And she's like, if all you do is trying to predict like osteoporotic risk, that's what I was doing. She said, why don't you just like do insurance and predict whether someone's going to have a car accident? So when you think about it, the idea is pretty much the same, right? So I was like, yeah, that makes sense. And being an actor, you earn a lot more money. So sure, why not? So my background has been, in this sort of like mathematics. I was doing a lot of modeling, machine learning before people call that machine learning. And that's how I started my career. And my first job was actually pricing insurance policies. But then through that journey, I started pricing a lot of different things, like your mobile plans, your interest rates for your banking product, exchange rates. And I guess because I was very technical in my early days, in my early 20s, I really spent my effort trying to master this technical excellence, right? I would spend so much time like just trying to remember all the Excel shortcuts, like trying to understand how to build a model, like trying to test my assumptions. But then you go into a meeting, I realized actually most people don't care so much about this nitty-gritty details. Like if you can't explain what you are doing to them in a concise way, you lose their interest very quickly. So that realization is probably how, I started learning more about how can I deliver my message more effectively in a way that resonates with people, just so they can keep engaged.
Wow, fantastic. How did you make that evolution? Was it attending lots of courses? Did you get a great mentor? Did you read lots of books? Or tell us about that journey from being someone who's very technical, analytical, going into the nitty-gritty to someone who's now influencing from the stage.
I read a lot of books. So there has been a lot of, self-learnings. The first book, I still remember this quite well. The first book is called The Pyramid Principle. It's written by this ex-McKinsey partner called Barbara Minto. And this book is really about, how to deliver a business recommendation effectively. And from there, obviously, I started reading more books on psychology, how brain works, because, one surprising fact about the brain is that when we listen to people, we don't activate our prefrontal cortex, which is the cognitive part, like who does the heavy lifting of analyzing things. We actually engage the so-called gatekeeper. And what this gatekeeper does is that it tries to assess whether whatever you are saying is worth my attention. Okay, you see? So unless you can trigger someone's curiosity, they probably would not listen to you. And I think for me, this is kind of like a really interesting realization. You're like, as a technical person, you tend to jump into the nitty-gritty details. You expect your counterparty to activate their, like this how would you call that? Like the super machine in your brain that does all the analytical work. But no, they don't do that unless you give them a reason that's convincing enough that they need to activate that processing center. They will not do so.
Right. So unless they can see what's in it for me, there's no progression beyond wanting to learn even more about your solutions, the products, the services that you offer. Is that right?
Totally, absolutely, exactly. Yeah.
Claire, tell our audience what's in it for them. Why master these skills going beyond someone who's technically brilliant in pricing, in data, to being an effective influencer? What's in it for them, Claire?
Yeah, I guess at the end of the day, right? Like when you have a good idea or a recommendation, you almost always need a team to support you to make it happen. In other words, it doesn't matter how good the idea is, unless you can make that a reality. It's just an idea. So it's important because, you will rely on people's help to make it happen. And the way you get them to say yes is to help them to see the value in your ideas. So they become your advocates. If you are a technically minded person or if you're a knowledge expert, like you might know everything about your discipline, but it's just sitting there unless you can communicate that effectively to your audience. And which is why this is quite an important skill to master in your life, because in our life, we don't live independently. We work in a society where we need to collaborate with other people. So the better you can convince someone to collaborate with you, the more success you will have in life.
Wonderful. I think you mentioned about the data alone doesn't translate into reality. I think the real reality that you're referring to is that value add, that impact it has on the lives of others, right? So whatever it is that your solutions are, your products, your services, ultimately, we are only as effective as the impact we make on the lives of others. And without being able to understand the human psychology behind decision making and to excite the audience to get to yes in a way that's meaningful to them, then, as we always say, insights or data without impact is just stuff. Right. And
information.
Information. Thank you. Tell me, when was the penny drop moment for you, Claire? You've journeyed. You were amazing with your data. You spent a lot of time with the preparation. When was the penny drop moment that made you say, I really want to lift my game with my influencing skills?
I guess probably the pivotal moment was when at that time, I've been working as a pricing analyst for maybe 2-3 years. And I felt like I was ready for a promotion, but, obviously I wasn't. So I was putting my hands up. I was like, I think I'm ready to become a manager, to manage people. I went for a couple opportunities internally, and there was this one interview I still remember, and that was to work with a very reputable leader in the organization, and it was a strategy role. And I really, really wanted to join his team. So this guy used to be a McKinsey partner, and I remember one of the questions he asked me was, "So Claire, tell me, how many piano tuners are there in Sydney?" So, I was kind of expecting this McKinsey style sort of interview, but still, when I was thrown with this question, I was like, oh, okay. So being someone who's quite technical, I started just like going through my calculation, like doing my calculation on the spot and sort of presenting my thinking logic. And then I still remember this. I didn't get a job. But after that, I reached out to this guy and I asked him for feedback. And he told me one thing that I remember really, really well. He said, Claire, I know what you are doing, but you haven't convinced me that you know what you are doing.
Wow.
And then he recommended me to read this book, The Pyramid Principle. And it was because of him, I really felt like, okay, you know what? This is something I need to work on. It doesn't matter how much you know, unless you convince the other person that you know what you're talking about. just it's
That
not
is
going to get you a
brilliant.
promotion. You won't step up in your career, and that's just a very useful skill you have to master. What can I say?
Well done, Claire. You're such a role model of a wonderful leader. You know, as one of the things we always teach is it's not what happens in your life, it's how you respond that really matters. You know, there's no failure, only
Yeah.
feedback. But really, the pivotal turning point for me, learning from your little wonderful anecdote, was when you decided to ask for feedback. And you know, your
Mm.
openness, having that growth mindset, not being defeated by a so-called setback, and yet going out there and asking for feedback. And let's face it, right? A lot of people fear feedback. And
Oh, yeah,
but
I'm a
your
sucker for
ability,
feedback.
yeah, great. So again, one of the things, you know, that very often people don't identify with when they say, "How do I make the journey to becoming a great influencer?" Courage is really important, right? That courage, that
Mm.
determination to be even better, that positive mindset to always want to create value. So what I'm hearing also from your example is for you to get that promotion, your organization has to see that you're a person who can add greater value. And you can only
Totally.
add greater value if the work, the intellect that you have about data and pricing can translate into
Mm.
value for the customer, and which then
Yes.
or internal stakeholders. You know, customers can be
Yes.
internal, external, and it then comes back to your organization as a return of the value that you've
Hmm.
created for them. Thank you so much for sharing of your wonderful journey and story, because we know we always like to showcase leaders, and you are not just through your life experiences, just the person that people are seeing right in front of them. A very articulate, very confident and competent human being,
Oh, thank
understanding
you.
the journey behind it, you know, of every one of us. Sometimes people think, boy, this person must be born that way, and yet we all born with the capacity to be able to do what you do, and yet it's in those significant, courageous moments when
Thank
you've made the important decisions. Yeah.
Thank you for highlighting that actually, because I think it's worth saying that I was definitely not born like this. Like, I am an introvert and naturally I don't like being sort of loud and being seen. And I still remember it took me a couple of years at university to just like raise my hands in class to ask a question. So if this helps anyone, I'd like to sort of highlight that this is definitely a learned skill set. No one is born with it. But through practice, through reading, through having this self-awareness, this is something you can definitely improve over time. And the journey is, I'm still on this journey, right? Like every day, I read a new book, I realize, okay, maybe I can try this here and there. So it's all about, having this growth mindset and be open to new ideas and be open to test it on yourself and see how can leverage that in your life and in your work.
Brilliant, brilliant. So, you know, getting back to this topic of influencing in the
Hmm.
absence of authority, many leaders feel frustrated when their ideas are logically sound. They've done a lot of
Hmm.
research and they still get rejected. From your perspective, why does this happen?
Uh, I mean, brilliant ideas get rejected all the time, right? Whether you like it or not. And many times the rejection has got nothing to do with the idea itself. And just let me give you a few examples. It can be rejected firstly because, maybe you didn't deliver the idea well enough. So your counterpart didn't see the full value of your idea. So in this case, it's not, the problem with this idea. It's actually a communication gap because your audience don't see the value behind your idea. Other times it can be, for example, it's a great idea. You've managed to deliver that effectively, but the timing is not right. So if the timing is not right, it can mean several things. Maybe it's the wrong budget cycle. Maybe at that time there's not enough resource. Maybe simply, they don't have the team to back this whole thing up. Because as I've mentioned earlier, you know, implementing something typically takes a team. It's never a one person's job. So when people push back because the timing is not right, you can try again, right? In next quarter,
Yeah.
next year, don't take the no as a no. It's just a market signal. And I think what's more important is to really understand the rationales, the reasons behind the no, and then go from there.
Beautiful. So it's less about the quality of the idea, but more very often when you talk about timing, the
Mm-hmm.
pain or the perceived pain of the problem they're experiencing and the value, the benefits that your product offers may
Mm-hmm.
not just be stacking up at that moment and not to take it personally. That's what I'm also hearing. Is that right? So one is about the
Exactly.
skill to bridge the gap. Very
Mm-hmm.
often it's a communication challenge and presenting the idea is not enough. You got to move people emotionally. Yes, to
Mm-hmm.
want to, and they get convinced,
Yeah.
they trust that your solution is the thing that will help them get what they want, get out of the pain or capitalize on an
Mm-hmm.
opportunity. And
Mm-hmm.
at times it's just a matter of timing. Yeah, and the pain
Yeah.
or challenge that they're facing right now compared to what the value proposition that you offer, it just doesn't
Yeah.
stack up at that moment. That's what we're hearing. Thank you so much. That's super insightful.
Exactly.
I love the some of the things that you and I have discussed before, which is the hidden cost of yes. We've spoken about the hidden cost that people associate with saying yes. Could you unpack that for us? I think you've touched on sometimes it's about timing,
Mm-hmm.
etc., etc. What other factors may be that people associate with the cost of saying yes to your solution?
Mm. Sure. Okay. So I think many leaders don't, let's put it this way. I think many leaders underestimate how much trust is required for people to start receiving your idea. Okay. So this is not even like endorsing your idea. This is just to receive. So as we discussed before, firstly, they need to assess, what do I get from helping you? And the cost here could be, okay, I'm using my cognitive effort trying to understand your idea. And if this
Mm,
turns out to be a complete waste of time, then my time would be wasted, right? So that's the first, hidden cost. They have to, I guess they have to bear is to know that they have to spend their time. And then secondly, your idea might be different to what they have been believing in or to what they have been publicly endorsing in the past. So backing your idea could also mean backing a position they have held strongly. So to them, this could be like, reputation risk, credibility risk. You have to
mm,
consider that as well. So there are many things, in corporates, obviously there's political risk. What happens if I back up this idea, but it fails? Do I have enough
mm,
capacity to manage this downside? Sometimes
mm,
people say no to an idea, not because they don't like the idea, but they just feel like, okay, if this thing doesn't work, I don't feel ready to bear the consequences. So when that happens,
mm.
then, as we've discussed, it's not so much about the idea itself. It's more about the risk management, whether someone can manage the risk of this idea not working.
Right. Wonderful. Claire, everything that you share resonates so much.
Mhm.
In fact, in my
I'm
first
glad.
experience, I spent 13
Hmm.
years with an Australian startup company, and this dude who was project manager, probably
Yeah.
back in the day, being sold as a consultant to a client at 800 a day, let's say,
Yeah.
walked in to a much larger multinational organization. Nothing had
Hmm.
changed about my work experience and all that, except I represented a much bigger brand. And all of a
Yeah.
sudden, that company was charging me out at 2200 a day, 800 to 2200. And very
Hmm.
often I still remember bidding against that larger company. And now that I know
Hmm.
that, boy, the quotation they may have provided would have been significantly higher than ours, and yet we often lost the bid to even a person who priced it much higher. And someone shared
Hmm.
with me once that put yourself in the shoes of the procurement managers shoes, for working for a large enterprise, deciding to buy from an Australian startup, relatively
Hmm.
unknown,
Hmm.
brand, $800 a day versus $2,200 a day. Not many people would take that risk of, or
Mm.
rather want to put their decision making on the line by
Hmm.
deciding on perhaps the startup company that may not have as great a reputation. I think your story and anecdote really resonates. Really resonates.
Yeah, that's a really good example, actually, because, then we are back to price, right? Like pricing. And people don't realize, you know, customers, they take your pricing as a signal for quality as well. So psychologically, we all unconsciously, when we buy something, we all unconsciously have this sort of rough idea on what's a fair price for what I'm buying. So when you price like outside or under this range, then sometimes even in the favor of your customers, they might feel suspicious. They might feel, why are they so cheap? Can they really deliver what I asked them to deliver?
Yeah.
So, which is why, in your case, you're a startup, you think you probably shouldn't charge more, but sometimes charging more probably will help you because it sends out a very good pricing signal to your customers that this is quality. That's why you are paying more for it.
Fantastic. Claire, with that wonderful knowledge that you have today, clearly you navigated a change in your career where you went simply from being a pricing analyst to an effective influencer to now being a coach to other people who are looking to make the leap into influence without authority. If you could maybe unpack, what are some practical steps someone could take to move from beyond someone who's clearly very bright, very intelligent, very good with data, very good with pricing, into someone who's an effective influencer. What would the steps be? What was your personal journey like?
Okay.
Beyond reading the book, yeah? What did you start doing differently?
Beyond reading the book. All right, let me summarize what are some of the things that I found very helpful. And the first one might surprise you, actually. I think the most important part is actually to have empathy. And when I say empathy, I mean to be able to see things from a different perspective. So, simply put, to be able to be in the shoes of the other person. And the reason I'm sort of putting this as the most important foundation is because unless you can see what your counterparty has been struggling or what their concerns are, it's very difficult to, communicate in a way that helps them to address their issue. Right? So, in pricing, we sort of like have the front row of seeing all this because sales managers or sales directors, they will constantly be pushing for discount. But if, you work in finance, then finance people would care more about margin. So if you go into a sales meeting and you're like, this proposal can really help you to grow the margin, they're like, we don't care about margin. We care about, whether we can hit the volume and get our bonus, right? So you need to see from their perspectives what is important. And once you know what's important for those people, you can start by addressing those issues. So that's the first one. And then the second one is really just to learn how to, how you can synthesize your thinking. I know this sounds very abstract, but you really need to be able to sort of like concise what you want to say in a very simple one sentence. What's the key message you are trying to deliver here? Because I felt that particularly for technically minded people is they like to go into the nitty-gritty details, but often lost the key message. And I felt a very good way to sort of like counter this problem is to start with having a very clear message first, and then everything sort of like wrapping around it. How can I support this key message? And it helps you to understand what sort of things you should say and what sort of things you shouldn't say. Things you should say are points that will support your key ideas, and things you should drop are points that will distract people from understanding your key ideas. So I think if you can master the two, firstly, have empathy to see different perspectives. Secondly, being able to know what's the key message, and then, bring points to support that. Then, you would be on a very good start comparing to many other people out there.
Brilliant. That's such a great structure. So start with empathy, caring deeply, stepping in the shoes of your stakeholders. Of course, there will be an end client. I was just speaking to, there was a wonderful financial planner analyst. So basically, this person does all the data, supports financial advisors who have the client-facing roles. And he spoke about that point precisely, how often he's amazing at collecting all the data and doing the research. And yet, missing that ability to have that empathy very often of the clients. What are they like? What age are they? What sort of challenges? What sort of aspirations? And we really spoke about, I think what I'm hearing you say is, as much as possible, get a seat in the table with the advisors, for instance, in that context there, so that you can hear firsthand from the customer, or at least influence the process, so that when you are getting secondhand information about what the data, what the customers really want, or the, when I say customers, again, internal or external, really having that empathy of that pains, and then structure your message with clarity to make sure you hit those points. Am I hearing it right?
Exactly. Yes.
Great.
Thank you for the summary. You've done a great job.
Not at all. Claire, how do you win a seat? Very often the salespeople are like, hey, you're working in the back office, you're doing all this analysis. How do you convince even these people that, because very often the analyst, the researcher's role is very often in the backdrop, you're supporting numerous people. How do you convince sometimes your internal stakeholders to give you an insight into that the challenges that they are looking to resolve?
Yeah. So you have to add value, basically. No one will ever invite you to the decision-making table unless they see the value you can bring. So, to start with, you have to be proactive, like schedule regular check-in, just try to understand what sort of business challenges they are facing, and proactively, share your insights. Let's say you sit on a lot of data, right? You see this all the time. Then you might see something they don't see. So in those cases, it's about like bringing that insight proactively to your stakeholders by asking them open questions. Really get down to the bottom of their challenges and then provide solutions. And when you do this sort of like over a period of time, let's say 3 to 6 months, then they start seeing you as someone who can help them with their business. So they will start bring their problems to you. And I've seen this firsthand, when in my last job, I joined and I inherited a team who are very technical. We're talking about, data scientists, pricing analysts, machine learning specialists, all that sort of people. They are brilliant, but they sort of, they do the work based on what the stakeholders ask them, and then they deliver. And that's it. And when you do that, people see you as having a role which is quite passive, So that's not good for the business. And what you have to do is really to sort of almost like switch this mindset. And I think this is what I would love to highlight. A lot of the time, the reason you feel like you are not a leader yet, it's not because of your title. It's because of your mindset. For me, being a leader, it's not about what position you have or what title you have, but about what sort of value you can add to the organization. And when you start thinking that you can add value, then you will naturally step up and be proactive, be the one providing those additional insights, even though people didn't ask you for. And when you do this for long enough period of time, then people really start seeing you as the leader. And that transformation is what I witnessed firsthand in my team, because I've just been telling them, this is what you have to do, go out and try it. And it works. Within a year, our senior stakeholders came to us and saying that, you guys are really important for our development. And we get invited to the business meetings. And just, I guess the point I'm trying to make is anyone can do that, but you just have to be very conscious of this.
Fantastic. And specifically what I'm hearing you say is that conscious shift from passively doing a task to being someone who's really outcome oriented. We speak about this in our workshops, being a person who creates impact to everyone around you. It could be your internal stakeholders and others, because people trust someone who seems to care about their outcomes, and they start to lean in.
Absolutely.
Right? And to trust
Yes.
and invite you to the table. And that's when you get an opportunity to influence more positively and create even greater meaning for yourself and the people that you serve as well. Wonderful. Thank you for being such a great role model of that. I'd just really love to get back to that point, because some of our audience may be thinking, wow, that was so insightful about being able to structure that key message. You mentioned about that part, the empathy was one. That was the clarity of that key message so that it lands. What are some ways that leaders can sequence or frame the message right? So that that key message, do you have a tips, strategies? How do you come about with that key message so that people are more open to your ideas?
Yeah, I have a very simple framework. It's called Headline-Insight-CTA.
Oh, headline insight
Headline-Insight
CTA. Okay.
CTA. Okay. So headline obviously is that one-liner, the most important message you think your audience needs to know. Insights will be all the bullet point that supports that headline. And CTA, call to action. This is really just like turn that headline into an action form. Whatever you say, that CTA is, because CTA is important because an idea doesn't turn into action, then it's just an idea. So the CTA is about how can I drive this to the next step to start creating some action. So headline, insight, CTA.
That is brilliant. I think what you're sharing is exactly the way decision makers think. What's in it for me? And back it up with your insights. And then, yeah, unless there's a call to action, then it's just entertainment or just data
Yeah.
or ideas. But I just love how you're structuring it so that you're communicating the way decision makers make decisions as opposed to, typical people who are very detail oriented. They spend all the time and here are the insights. They go through so much detail without even starting with why should it matter to you? Right? And
Exactly.
your headline is, as you said, your headline is so key that we nail it so that people can immediately be drawn in to say, oh, geez, okay. Then back it up with insights, credibility, and clearly a call to action, because without action, nothing changes, right? So thank you
Yes.
so much. Give us some advice. What can leaders do to reduce perceived risk so that saying yes feels safe?
Okay. This is a very good question. What can leaders do to reduce or to help the counterparty to reduce the perceived risk, right? There are quite a few things you can do. And I'm just going to share like maybe a couple of like very tangible things. The first is don't make the meeting your first point of contact. And what I mean by that is a meeting room is not a place where you share your idea for the first time. A meeting room should be a room where you get alignment publicly, meaning that all the decision, more or less, needs to be made before the meeting starts. And what that means is, you can reach out to the people like off the line individually. And through that process, you start to learn about their concerns, their risk, things that they care about. So when you get to the meeting room, you actually can preempt most of that. So that's the first thing. The other thing is really just try to build like a relationship over time, because people trust people they like. And if you can create that trust beforehand, then it really places you on a head start comparing to many people. Because, even when you say something they don't agree, they will probably try to help you to find a consensus rather than just like reject your ideas straight away. So having that sort of relationship is also very important, in my opinion.
Wow. So what I'm hearing you say is very often the winning in terms of positive influence is actually done before the meeting, and the meeting is really about
Oh,
alignment.
totally. Exactly. Yes.
And you do a lot of the groundwork to build and establish trust, being likable, showing concern and empathy outside of the meeting. And what I'm also hearing you say is garnering perspectives, even if you hear objections beforehand, learning how to address that so that when you come to the table, it's pretty much about alignment and agreement, because most of the people have already come on board. How do you deal with someone who is maybe you got a meeting room and there are three, four people, and three people seem to be really on board, and there's one really resistant stakeholder? How would you deal with that? What's your advice?
Yeah, so as I've said, right, like before the meeting, you should know who is the person who's most likely to be there resisting your idea. And before the meeting, you have to address that. And there are several ways on how you can address that. Firstly, are they resisting you or are they resisting your idea? Okay, those
Okay.
are two very different things. If they are resisting you, then a better way is probably try to find an ally that they trust. So use their mouth rather than yours to get them on board.
Right.
And also it helps to understand their own internal decision-making process. Because for some people, they are, let's say, consensus seekers. So once they know most people are on board, then they are most likely to be on board as well. But some people,
Mm.
they are more analytical. What that means is they really need to see a lot more data, a lot more trial results, a lot more testimonial for them to feel safe. So your job is really try to figure out what makes this person feel safe by understanding their decision-making process. And how do you understand that decision-making process? By talking to this person and through that conversation, figuring out how they make decisions.
Wow. That is fantastic. So you're looking for someone's what you call decision-making process. Give us an idea of a
Mm.
question you might ask someone to elicit that.
I think maybe one thing you can try is, like point out the obvious. So
Mm.
if they kind of, say things in a way that you feel like they're just rejecting this idea, you can say something like, let's just be sort of straight here. What I'm hearing is a lot of resistance. Do you mind sharing with me what is it that concerns you the most? Ask open questions, get them to talk, but don't position that in a way as you are accusing them. Position as a way that you are trying to understand them because you want to help them.
Wow. That is so brilliant. It's almost like you have to be a professional coach to be an amazing influencer.
Almost. I, I do think having some coaching skills helps. And Dom, you are a coach, right? So you will know this the best, like the power of asking open questions. Sometimes you need people to land at their conclusions by themselves, and your job is, not to lead them there, but to shine a light on the path so they can go there by themselves.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is also that resistance is just part and parcel of a journey to acceptance.
Mm,
And very often resistance may not be a no, except that
hmm
you have to understand what their resistance points are and genuinely going into those conversations with curiosity to find that out. And even the process of empathy and listening alone can actually make that person feel a whole lot more comfortable about the proposition that you're offering.
Yeah.
And also what I'm hearing you say is that
Mhm.
the need to tailor your communication style with
Mm,
that person. I think you mentioned earlier that some people need to see a lot of data before they're convinced. So what is
hmm
their internal convincer strategy, if you like,
hmm
knowing that everyone has different personality types and your ability to adapt the way you
hmm
communicate, the way you present your ideas is a very critical one as well.
Yeah, exactly. Being able to translate your message in a way that lands effectively with your counterparty. So, you have to play the role of being a translator.
Wow, absolutely fantastic. This really aligns with what we often say. I think influence begins with
Mm,
the trust, the empathy, the understanding, what's in it for them, and then really presenting your ideas in a way that lands effectively. If there is
yes.
one mindset shift you want leaders to
hmm
remember when influencing without authority, Claire, what would it be?
Mm. Um, I would give them the same advice as to, you know, the speakers I coach, which is you are there to serve. And this is quite a funny one because a lot of speakers come to me and they all have this problem of being on stage. They are worried that people will judge them for their performance, blah blah blah. And the simplest way to overcome this fear is you start seeing your job as to help them, to serve them. So it's no longer about your performance, whether, and in the case of influence, it's no longer about whether you can win the argument, whether you can deliver your message in an effective way. It's more about how can I help this person to solve their problem? So when you lead with that mindset, then every question you ask, come from a good place of curiosity, trying to help them. And when they sense that, there's this reciprocal relationship where they will also be more open and telling you how you will be best positioned to help them as well.
Amazing. Amazing. The mindset of a servant leader. and being out there to create a positive
Yes.
impact. It sounds like you're going way beyond, working with people who are into pricing. Clearly, many of the strategies you speak are generally about influencing in any role, with or without
Mm-hmm.
position or authority. To hear you now, going into the space where you are influencing speakers, right, on the stage. Wow, that is an incredible journey. Incredible journey.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting one for me. I certainly learned a lot on this journey myself as well. And as I've shared with you earlier, the journey is still going on. I am still learning new things every day.
Wonderful. Claire, share with us what was your trigger to move from someone who was working in corporates, organizations, into someone that I am assuming now is an entrepreneur writing your own book. I can't wait to hear a little bit more about that as well. But let's speak firstly about how you made your personal journey, yes,
Mm-hmm.
from where you were, corporate role, into now. Am I
Mm-hmm.
right that you are now your own
I would
an
call it, yeah, a
entrepreneur and consultant?
solopreneur. Yeah,
Solopreneur.
yeah.
Wonderful. How did you make that leap?
I mean, for me, I've sort of, I guess my approach to career is I go where my curiosity leads me, right?
Wow.
So there has been a period of time I was working for large organizations, and then I thought, you know what, like maybe I should try to work for a startup. So I joined a startup.
Oh.
And then after a
Mm.
while, I'm like, you know what? Like I can see the pros and cons between a startup and an organization. And maybe it is time for me to go back to an organization. So what I'm saying is, for me, having spent the past 2 decades working in companies of some sorts, it's just I arrived at a moment where I felt like, you know what, maybe it's time to try how it feels like to work by myself. Who knows?
Mm.
Maybe in a few months or a few years' time, I would decide that I want to work with a team, with an organization again. So
Mm.
I don't see this kind of things as in, like I see this as a revolving door where you open the door, you take a walk around in the garden or whatever. If you like it, you stay there. If you don't, you come back. But you will always
Brilliant.
learn something in this process.
Brilliant. I'm so grateful that you have that amazing mindset because Claire, that has what brought you and I together. I think we met through
Yeah,
LinkedIn.
exactly.
And just that curiosity factor, you popping the question and saying, "Hey Dom, love to meet." And we both used to study at UNSW, University of New South Wales.
Yes.
We have that shared
XU
background
cells.
and history. And I still remember having this first conversation with you maybe about a month ago. And just
Hmm.
instantly, you impress us with your energy and your passion and your heart to serve. We always look for people who we feel resonates with our values, which is first and foremost being a person of impact to the world in a very positive way. But I'm so grateful that your growth mindset, your curiosity has led us to having this conversation. And I do know that our participants are the audience is getting so much value. I know I have, it's so reinforcing and so
Thank you so
inspiring as
much.
well. And which is absolutely amazing. Tell the audience a little bit more about that book you're working on, Claire.
Okay, so the book, the title is The Price of Influence. And basically it's a book about how can you influence more effectively from a pricer's perspective. So some of the idea I talk about are some pricing principles we use all the time. But you can adopt the same principle to help you. And fundamentally, like the core idea is quite simple. It's about treating your idea as the product and your stakeholders or whoever you need to get a yes from as your buyers. So unless they see enough value from buying in your idea, they will not say yes. So your job becomes how can I deliver enough value so that the cost of saying yes is less than the value of saying yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. One final question, if I may, Claire.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I want you to imagine many, many, many years down the road when it's all said and done and you're looking back with pride at your career. How would you measure success in your
How would
career?
I in career or in life?
In your career, career is a huge, huge part of our lives. Clearly, it's our way
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
give and create meaning. And
Yeah.
provide
Yeah.
for loved ones. But yeah,
Yeah.
what would make you look back and say,
Mm.
wow, that was amazing?
I think this is gonna sound really cliche, but I think for me, it's having this sort of feeling that I have made an impact to someone's life. Big or small, right? And if I can achieve that, then I will feel very satisfied.
Wow. Thank you, Claire. What a powerful way to finish this episode. And I hope this will not be the last. Looking forward to joining with you and can't wait to hear more about your book. Reaching out to you and connecting with you, we'll
Hmm.
all have that in the show notes. But if there's one convenient place for the audience to want to
Hmm.
reach out to you and ask questions and get to know you even better, what would be the best way, Claire? How can our audience find you?
Yeah, the best way is probably connect with me on LinkedIn. So I post on LinkedIn regularly. I read all the messages I receive on the platform. This is also a platform where I announce, the latest of, my work. So, for the book, it's going to come out in September. So I'm sort of just like working on the final touches of things. And it will definitely be announced on LinkedIn as well.
Thank you. Claire, with that, wish you the very best in all your endeavors. Keep touching
Thank
lives.
you, Dom.
Know that what we leave behind one day is not what's written inscribed in tombstones, but what we weave into the lives of others. And I want you to be assured that your work, we'll do our very best to make sure as many people benefit from this wonderful session we've had with you. Thank you for your generosity of spirit and sharing with us not just some practical tools and strategies, but importantly also the mindset of a leader. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Dom. Really appreciate it.